in the vastness of the galaxy, where stars stretched endlessly in every direction and planets spun silently in the black void. The rules of space had always been clear to those who dared to explore it. Every civilization, every empire, every fleet understood that venturing into another system without permission was not only dangerous but could be catastrophic. Among the countless star systems scattered across the spiral arms of the galaxy, one system stood out, not because of its riches or size, but because of the warnings that surrounded it. Terran space had long been marked as forbidden, a region that was shrouded in mystery, cloaked in secrecy, and carefully avoided by travelers, traders, and empires alike. Stories circulated across countless worlds about what lay within Terran space. Some whispered about advanced technologies that could manipulate the very fabric of reality. Others spoke of devastating defenses that no fleet, no matter how powerful, could survive. Despite the uncertainty, the Terran system became legendary among pilots and historians. For decades, records from explorers who had skirted its edges described unusual energy signatures, abnormal gravitational readings, and signals that didn't fit any known pattern. Ships would report sudden malfunctions when approaching its borders, and in some cases, entire scout missions vanished without explanation. These events, carefully documented by explorers from various empires, were treated as warnings, messages carved into the very history of interstellar travel. Do not enter Terran space. It is forbidden. Respect it, or face consequences beyond understanding. The Empire, a sprawling and ambitious civilization, had always prided itself on its strength, technology, and superiority over neighboring systems. Its fleets were unmatched in size and firepower, its starships bristling with weapons and equipped with the most sophisticated navigation and defense systems, were symbols of the Empire's might. Generals and admirals often boasted that no system, no matter how well protected, could withstand the Empire's advance. Overconfidence was a trait deeply ingrained in the leadership. For generations, the Empire had expanded its territory, claiming planets rich in minerals, resources, and strategic positions. Each conquest had reinforced the belief that their power was absolute, that no warning, no legend, and no mysterious force could stand in their way. When the stories of Terran space reached the highest councils of the Empire, they were met with skepticism. Advisors tried to stress caution, recounting the strange incidents recorded by explorers. They explained how fleets had experienced inexplicable technical malfunctions, how energy readings in the system suggested the presence of advanced and unknown technology, and how several probes sent decades earlier had simply vanished. Yet the ruling council dismissed these warnings. They labeled them as superstition, exaggeration, or fear. In the eyes of the Empire, the Terran system was just another frontier, another territory waiting to be claimed. Preparations for entering Terran space began with the same confidence and arrogance that had accompanied every successful campaign the Empire had undertaken. Fleet commanders studied star maps meticulously, identifying routes that would allow them to approach the system with maximum efficiency. The Empire spared no expense. Massive warships, capable of destroying entire planetary defenses, were mobilized. Scouts and probes equipped with sensors far beyond ordinary standards were sent ahead. Their mission to map the system and identify any potential threats. The Empire's leaders believed that their advanced technology and overwhelming numbers would guarantee success. But while the Empire's fleets prepared with precision and pride, the Terrans watched silently from their hidden positions. To the Empire, Terran space seemed empty, almost inviting, a place where conquest would be easy and rewards plentiful. But the apparent calm of the system was an illusion. The Terrans had anticipated the curiosity and arrogance of others. They had studied the galaxy for centuries, learning how empires behaved, how fleets moved, and how power could be projected across the stars. Terran defense systems were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They were not merely weapons. They were intelligent, adaptive, and deeply integrated into the fabric of the system itself. Planets could appear lifeless but held hidden infrastructures, capable of manipulating energy fields, communications, and even gravity in ways that would seem impossible to any unprepared observer. For many within the Empire, the notion that they could be outmatched by a forbidden system was inconceivable. Fleet officers held secret debates in their chambers, with some expressing unease, but the dominant sentiment was one of certainty. "We are the strongest," they would say. "No system can resist us. Terran space is just a story, a myth created to frighten those who lack courage." This hubris was echoed throughout the ranks. Young officers, trained in the glory of Empire victories, saw Terran space as an exciting challenge, an opportunity to prove their valor and secure fame and promotion. The warnings of vanished fleets, a strange phenomena, and unusual energy readings were ignored, laughed off, or rationalized as technical glitches. In private, however, a few commanders felt a flicker of unease. They could not ignore the cumulative weight of centuries of warnings. Still, even their concerns were overridden by the Council's insistence that the Empire would prevail. The cultural context of the Empire further reinforced their arrogance. Within its core worlds, the Empire had built a society that glorified expansion and conquest. Children were taught stories of legendary fleets that had overcome impossible odds, Statues of heroes who had claimed uncharted worlds decorated the capital cities. History books emphasized triumph, courage, and the inevitability of empire dominance. In such an environment, the idea of a place in the galaxy that could resist or punish the empire was almost unthinkable. Terran space, therefore, became not a source of caution but a tempting challenge. To enter it was to demonstrate power. To ignore it, in the empire's view, was a missed opportunity as preparations continued. The empire mobilized thousands of ships, ranging from massive war cruisers to nimble scout vessels. Each ship carried elite crews, trained not just in combat but in logistics, navigation, and strategy. Communication networks were fortified to allow instant coordination across vast distances, and intelligence officers worked tirelessly to gather any available information about Terran space. But despite all this planning, one key element was missing: respect. The Empire did not approach the system with caution or humility. They did not consider that the Terrans might possess knowledge, technology, or abilities beyond comprehension. They assumed that sheer force would be enough to dominate, to conquer, and to extract whatever resources or strategic advantage the system held. Meanwhile, within Terran space, there was a quiet awareness of the approaching threat. The Terrans had not sought conflict. Their priority was safeguarding their domain and preventing outside interference. Yet, they were prepared. Advanced sensors detected the Empire's mobilization long before the first ships crossed the border. Automated systems were activated, carefully calibrated to respond to threats while remaining invisible to those who did not understand their complexity. The Terrans observed the Empire's movements, not with fear, but with measured patience. They understood the psychology of overconfidence, the patterns of those who underestimated danger, and the inevitability that some would interpret forbidden space as an opportunity in many ways. Part 1 of this story is about contrasts: the Empire's arrogance versus the Terrans' caution, overconfidence versus preparation, myth versus reality. The Empire's focus on conquest blinded them to centuries of warnings and the possibility that Terran space was unlike any other region in the galaxy. Terran space, by contrast, was ready not through brute force alone, but through intelligence, foresight, and an intimate understanding of the galaxy's complex systems. The Empire saw empty planets and calm stars, and assumed victory. The Terrans, hidden and vigilant, watched the signs, prepared for the moment when the overconfident invaders would make their first move. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that Part 1 is not just about the setting or the fleets. It is about mindset. It is about hubris and the failure to respect the unknown. The Empire's leaders believed in their inevitability, in their right to claim any space they desired. They interpreted the warning signs as exaggeration, a challenge, or superstition. Yet the galaxy is vast, and not all knowledge is within reach. Not all systems are meant to be understood or conquered. Terran space was a silent guardian, a warning written in energy, anomalies, and the unexplained disappearance of those who had come before. The Empire's ignorance of this warning set the stage for the trials, the danger, and the lessons that lay ahead. The Empire's fleet was fully prepared, fully confident, and fully unaware of the true nature of Terran space. Ships gleamed in the light of distant stars, weapon systems hummed with energy, and communication lines buzzed with coordination orders. Officers reviewed maps, plotted courses, and rehearsed scenarios. Every detail had been considered except one: the fact that they were walking into a space that had defended itself against intruders for centuries. Every story, every warning, and every mysterious disappearance had pointed to a simple truth: Terran space was forbidden for a reason, and ignoring that reason would have consequences that no one in the Empire could imagine. As the Empire's fleet advanced toward Terran space, the excitement within the command ranks was palpable. There was a sense of inevitability, a belief that success was already written into history. Generals walked the corridors of the warships, confident in their authority, while crew members performed drills with precision, eager to prove their worth. The Empire had always thrived on momentum, and now, with hundreds of ships moving together like a single, unstoppable organism, the feeling of power was intoxicating. Yet, beneath the confidence, there was a subtle tension, a sense that something was not quite right. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but some of the most experienced officers could feel it. A whisper of unease carried through the vastness of space. The first signs came from the scouts. These small, nimble ships, equipped with the Empire's most advanced sensors, were tasked with mapping the borders of Terran space, recording energy readings, and identifying potential threats. Initially, the readings were puzzling but not alarming. Energy fluctuations appeared to be random, spatial distortions were minor, and no hostile presence was detected. The Council in the Empire's capital interpreted these anomalies as technical issues, nothing more. "It's just the instruments," the chief of logistics assured his peers. "The Terran system is not unusual. The sensors are overreacting." But as the fleet moved closer, the anomalies grew more pronounced. Communications between ships began to flicker intermittently, sometimes dropping out entirely. Navigational systems experienced brief failures, and several ships reported strange gravitational distortions. as though invisible forces were tugging at them from unseen sources. Despite these growing signs, the Empire pressed forward. Pride and overconfidence blinded its leaders to the possibility that these were not mere malfunctions. Fleet officers tried to rationalize every strange occurrence: a sudden power drop, a minor engineering glitch, a ship drifting off course, a pilot error, entirely missing fleets. Perhaps they had been delayed or rerouted. The warnings that had been written in history. The tales of explorers who had vanished in Terran space were dismissed as there was an unspoken assumption that the Empire's might could overcome anything, even forces they could not yet perceive. Meanwhile, the Terrans were quietly observing every movement. Unlike the Empire, they did not rush into action. They did not respond to each anomaly individually or reveal themselves prematurely. Instead, they studied the Empire's fleet, tracking the routes, speeds, and formations of each ship. Terran technology was not just advanced, it was adaptive. Sensors were capable of analyzing the behavior of foreign vessels in real time, predicting their next moves, and preparing defensive measures long before an attack could occur. Energy fields could be manipulated to create illusions, diverting attention, confusing pilots, and causing them to misjudge distances and speeds. Small, invisible disruptions could ripple through the fleet's systems, delaying actions and forcing commanders to make decisions with incomplete or misleading information. Within the Empire, unease began to creep in among a few cautious officers. They started to question the wisdom of pressing forward so aggressively. "We are entering an unknown system," one admiral remarked privately. "We should proceed with caution. These anomalies are not random. Something is watching us, and I am not convinced we understand what." But even these voices of caution were quickly silenced by the ruling council's insistence on momentum. "We are the Empire," the council member reminded them. "No system can resist our strength. Our technology is superior. Our fleet is unmatched. Hesitation is weakness, and we will not allow it." Orders were sent to continue, and the warnings of the few cautious officers were set aside as unnecessary fear. As the fleet drew closer to the heart of Terran space, the anomalies became impossible to ignore. Communication failures grew longer, lasting for minutes at a time. Ships reported instruments behaving erratically, compasses spinning wildly, engines fluctuating in power output, shields momentarily failing, and automated defense systems triggering without provocation. Even the Empire's most advanced navigational computers began to experience glitches, miscalculating trajectories and producing warnings that were difficult to interpret. These disturbances, though subtle at first, began to sow seeds of doubt among the fleet's crew. Whispers circulated in the corridors of the ships. "Something is here. Something is watching us." Yet each time someone raised a concern, they were reminded of the Empire's confidence. "This is space," they were told. "Unexplained anomalies are normal. Our mission continues." The Terrans, invisible and patient, increased the intensity of their subtle disruptions. Energy fields were manipulated to create temporary gravitational shifts, sending some of the Empire's smaller vessels slightly off course. Power fluctuations targeted key systems, forcing engineers to scramble to maintain stability. Illusions projected into sensor arrays made distant planets appear closer or farther than they were, creating confusion in the fleet's formation. These tactics were not aggressive attacks in the traditional sense. They were calculated measures designed to test the Empire, observe their reactions, and prepare for what would happen if the Empire continued to advance recklessly. The Terrans understood that arrogance could be a far more dangerous enemy than any weapon, and they exploited it to the fullest. Inside the fleet, tension began to rise. Junior officers, who had once looked forward to the glory of being part of this historic mission, now felt an underlying fear. Reports of malfunctions, strange energy readings, and subtle sabotage circulated among the crews. Engineers worked long hours attempting to diagnose problems that defied explanation. Pilots learned to navigate through temporary anomalies, adjusting their courses as gravitational distortions shifted unpredictably. The sense of control that the Empire had relied upon was slipping, replaced by uncertainty and unease. Yet the Council's insistence on moving forward remained absolute. Retreat or caution were unthinkable. To stop would be to admit weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. Despite the growing challenges, the Empire attempted to maintain order through rigorous protocols. Fleet commanders held meetings, reviewing anomalies, recalibrating systems, and attempting to restore communications. Standard operating procedures were followed meticulously, but every effort seemed to be undermined by Terran interference. Ships that had been functioning perfectly would suddenly experience multiple system failures simultaneously. The anomaly patterns were intelligent and adaptive, responding to the Empire's attempts to correct them. Even the most experienced engineers began to realize that these problems were not random. Something or someone was actively observing and manipulating the fleet's operations. As the Empire entered deeper into Terran space, the first direct encounters with the unknown occurred. Scout ships reported unusual energy readings near uninhabited planets. Navigation systems warned of hazards that did not appear in any star charts. Some crew members claimed to see flashes of light or movement at the edges of their sensor, ranged things that could not be identified or explained. The Council remained dismissive, interpreting these reports as sensor malfunctions, optical illusions, or overactive imaginations. But the reality was undeniable. The Empire was in the presence of a civilization that had long mastered the manipulation of space, energy, and perception. The subtle warnings had become unavoidable, and the Empire's inability to recognize the danger foreshadowed the coming escalation. Meanwhile, the Terran's observation systems had logged every detail of the Empire's approach. They could track fleet size, formation patterns, and even the decision-making hierarchy within the command chain. This intelligence allowed the Terrans to anticipate responses, predict movements, and prepare countermeasures without revealing their presence. They did not need to attack openly. Their advantage lay in patience, preparation, and precision. By letting the Empire advance while experiencing subtle, disorienting interference, the Terrans ensured that when the critical moment came, the Empire would be unprepared for the full scope of their defenses. The growing tension within the Empire's fleet was mirrored by curiosity and anticipation among the crews. Some began to speculate about what awaited them deeper in Terran space. Rumors spread quickly, tales of invisible weapons, intelligent systems, and energy fields capable of destroying ships without a trace. While some officers laughed at these stories, attributing them to fear, others quietly wondered if the legends of forbidden Terran space were more than just myth. It was the beginning of a psychological challenge, one that the Terrans had designed to weaken the Empire's confidence and test their readiness. As days turned into weeks of cautious advancement, the Empire's leadership still refused to acknowledge the danger fully. Council members, generals, and admirals were determined to complete the mission. Any suggestion of retreat was met with stern reprimands. Yet the subtle challenges they faced disrupted communications. Fluctuating power systems, navigational errors, and mysterious phenomena were eroding morale. Engineers were working longer hours, crews were exhausted, and pilots were increasingly wary of what lay ahead. Despite all this, the Empire continued forward, blinded by pride and ambition, unaware that each step deeper into Terran space was a step into danger far greater than anything they had faced before. Their fleet had advanced into the outer edges of Terran space, experiencing a growing series of challenges that they could not explain. Subtle sabotage, anomalies, and unexplained events had begun to shake their confidence. Yet hubris prevented them from considering retreat. The Terrans remained hidden, observing, learning, and preparing for the decisive actions that would soon follow. In this phase, the Empire had encountered its first real challenge, not from weapons or armies, but from a civilization capable of manipulating the very environment of space itself. The stage was set for escalation, and the consequences of ignoring the warnings were beginning to manifest in ways that would test every aspect of the Empire's power, skill, and judgment. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The Empire, confident in its size, technology, and past victories, had moved deep into Terran space, dismissing centuries of warnings as superstition. The anomalies that had begun as minor inconveniences now escalated into unmistakable threats, demonstrating that Terran space was far from ordinary and that the Empire had underestimated what lay before them. The calm that had greeted the fleet upon entering the system vanished, replaced by chaos, confusion, and fear. For the first time, the officers, the engineers, and the crews of the Empire's massive armada realized that they were not dealing with mere technical difficulties or myths. They were facing a force that could manipulate reality itself. The initial signs of this escalation were sudden and shocking. Fleet communication systems, once flawless, began failing entirely. Ships that had previously been in constant contact with command lost signal completely, their crews unable to report their positions or status. Panic spread as captains struggled to regain control over their vessels. Attempts to restore communication only intensified the problem. Signals bounced erratically, sometimes returning distorted, filled with strange interference patterns and garbled noise that made interpretation nearly impossible. The Empire's advanced communication arrays, designed to function across vast interstellar distances, were proving useless. Officers frantically tried to troubleshoot the issue, but it became clear that these disruptions were not accidental. They were deliberate, precise, and calculated. Whoever or whatever was behind them understood the fleet's technology intimately. Alongside these communication failures came physical disruptions to the fleet's ships. Engines, shields, and weapon systems began to behave unpredictably. A cruiser would suddenly experience a massive energy drain, leaving it adrift in the cold void, vulnerable to collision or attack. A destroyer's weapon systems would fire spontaneously, not in response to commands, but as if controlled by an unseen intelligence. These events were terrifying not because of the damage they caused, which was already significant, but because they demonstrated that the Empire had lost control. The fleet, which had prided itself on precision, discipline, and absolute authority, was now at the mercy of forces it could not see or predict. Officers ordered their crews to maintain formation, to keep moving forward, but the formations themselves began to break apart as ships were pulled off course, often with deadly consequences. Scouts and reconnaissance vessels were among the first to encounter Terran defenses directly. These ships, small, agile, and designed for observation rather than combat, reported anomalies that seemed impossible. Entire sectors of space appeared to bend and distort. Stars, planets, and asteroids seemed to shift in position, creating disorienting navigational hazards. Sensors detected massive energy fields that pulsed rhythmically, almost as if alive, interacting with the fleet in ways that defied the Empire's understanding of physics. Pilots described the sensation of invisible forces tugging at their ships, spinning them around or pushing them away from safe routes. Some of the bravest scouts reported seeing phenomena that were entirely inexplicable. Glowing shapes moving in patterns that suggested intelligence, flashes of light that communicated meaning, and energy distortions that seemed to anticipate every attempt to avoid them. These early encounters were not yet catastrophic, but they were sufficient to shake confidence. Crew members whispered rumors of ghosts in the system, of technology so advanced that it could control reality itself. Engineers worked tirelessly to diagnose the causes of the malfunctions, often to no avail. Some of the anomalies were too complex to understand, adapting faster than they could measure. The Empire's sense of superiority, carefully cultivated for generations, it began to erode as officers realized that Terran space operated according to rules that they did not know and could not predict. As the Empire pressed deeper, the anomalies escalated into overtly dangerous events. Ships began disappearing entirely. One moment a cruiser would be visible on sensors, the next it would vanish, leaving no trace. No debris, no energy signatures, no distress signals, nothing. Officers and commanders were shocked. Entire squadrons reported similar disappearances, and those left behind were forced to witness the destruction of comrades without any means of assistance. Survivors' accounts varied, but many described the same phenomena. A sudden, overwhelming force that engulfed their ships, tearing them apart with a precision and swiftness that defied explanation. The Empire's leadership could no longer dismiss the situation as mere technical difficulties or navigational hazards. This was deliberate, intelligent defense, and it was lethal. Morale within the fleet began to plummet. Junior officers, once eager to prove themselves, now feared every new report from scouts and engineers. Pilots hesitated, knowing that the slightest miscalculation could result in immediate destruction. Engineers worked around the clock, often sacrificing sleep and health to try and regain control of failing systems. Yet each success was temporary. New failures appeared in unexpected places, targeting different ships and systems each time, creating the impression that the Terrans had intimate knowledge of the fleet's vulnerabilities. Rumors and fear spread quickly. The once confident crews of the Empire now questioned whether they would survive, whether their technology could protect them, and whether their leaders had understood the danger at all. The Empire's command attempted to regain control through aggressive measures. Orders were issued to form tighter formations, to increase patrols, to overwhelm the perceived threats with firepower, and to push further into Terran space. Yet these efforts failed catastrophically. The Terran forces, remaining largely unseen, used the Empire's own momentum against them. Ship movements were anticipated, weapons neutralized or redirected, and formations manipulated so that vessels collided or became isolated. In one instance, a fleet attempting to regroup after a series of anomalies found itself caught in a gravitational distortion that separated lead ships from support vessels. The resulting chaos left several cruisers vulnerable, and though no direct attack was visible, the isolated ships were quickly destroyed by forces beyond comprehension. By now, the Empire could no longer ignore the possibility that Terran space was defended by a civilization that had mastered technologies far beyond their own. Yet even with this realization, retreat was not considered. To admit fear or to turn back would have been a humiliation that the Empire could not tolerate. Leadership doubled down, pushing forward with increasingly desperate attempts to impose control. Commands were sent, strategies re-evaluated, and contingencies tested, but each action was anticipated and neutralized by the unseen defenders. The Empire's belief in its invincibility, once a source of strength, became a liability. Each decision, each order, each maneuver was manipulated in ways that the commanders could neither understand nor counter. The Terrans, observing all this, did not intervene directly at first. Their strategy relied on patience and precision. They had designed the system's defenses to neutralize the Empire without immediate confrontation, allowing them to assess the enemy's strengths, weaknesses, and reactions. Subtle interference had become overtly strategic. By targeting key systems, isolating ships, and creating psychological pressure, the Terrans systematically dismantled the Empire's operational cohesion. The result was a slow, methodical erosion of the fleet's confidence, discipline, and ability to act decisively. Officers struggled to maintain order, often forced to make choices with incomplete or misleading information. In doing so, they played directly into the Terrans' hands. As the first direct encounters escalated, the Empire began to experience casualties on an unprecedented scale. Not all losses were due to combat. Many ships were destroyed by environmental manipulation, forced into collisions with invisible obstacles, or torn apart by energy fields that could not be seen or blocked. Survivors reported terrifying events, entire decks of ships being destroyed without warning, instruments melting or exploding, and glimpses of shapes that seemed almost sentient, interacting with the ships as if aware of the crew's presence. Panic and fear became rampant. Those who survived long enough to witness these events described them as unlike anything they had been trained for or imagined possible. Even the Empire's most battle-hardened veterans found themselves questioning the very nature of reality. Amid this chaos, the critical moment approached when the Empire realized that it had underestimated Terran space entirely. A flagship carrying high-ranking officers, including generals and council representatives, became isolated during one of the system's increasingly aggressive anomalies. In an instant, it was overwhelmed. The energy that engulfed the ship was precise and devastating. Sensors recorded the destruction in horrifying detail. Shields failed simultaneously, engines shut down, and weapon systems were neutralized. The flagship was obliterated, leaving nothing behind. The loss of this ship, and the high-ranking officials aboard, sent shockwaves through the rest of the fleet. Panic became widespread, command structures began to fail, and the Empire's once mighty fleet teetered on the brink of collapse. In the aftermath of the flagship's destruction, the Empire's leadership finally began to comprehend the scale of their era. Terran space was not just a region of mystery, it was a domain that had been carefully prepared for intruders, defended by a civilization that had mastered intelligence, technology, and strategy to a degree far beyond the Empire's imagination. The subtle warnings they had ignored, the anomalies they had dismissed, and the tales they had laughed at were all real. Every vanishing scout, every malfunctioning ship, every unexplained event had been a message. Terran space was forbidden for a reason. The Empire had paid a heavy price for ignoring that warning, and the cost was measured not just in ships and crews lost, but in the shattering of their confidence and the humiliation of realizing that they were not invincible. The crews, those who survived the escalating attacks and anomalies, were left in a state of disbelief. They had entered what they believed would be a routine campaign of expansion and domination, but instead had found themselves in a nightmare of incomprehensible forces. Engineers, pilots, and soldiers struggled to adapt, but the reality of Terran space's defenses left them feeling powerless. Morale plummeted, discipline wavered, and fear became a constant companion. Even those who had once argued for the Empire's inevitability now understood that they had ventured into a domain they could not control, facing an enemy whose methods, knowledge, and capabilities were beyond anything they had imagined. The Empire was no longer confident, no longer in control, and no longer certain of survival. The escalation had reached its peak, transforming what had begun as minor anomalies into catastrophic events that demonstrated the Terrans' overwhelming superiority. The Empire had encountered the full force of the system's defenses not through direct combat alone, but through a combination of environmental manipulation, psychological pressure, and calculated technological interference. The stage was set for the resolution that would follow, and the Empire's leaders were forced to confront the reality that Terran space was not merely forbidden, but lethal for those who entered without understanding. By the time the Empire's fleet reached the heart of Terran space, it was no longer a cohesive force. The once proud armada, which had set out with confidence and a sense of inevitability, had been battered, disoriented, and psychologically strained. Ships that had been state-of-the-art were now failing unpredictably, and crews who had once been fearless were trembling in fear. The Empire had underestimated Terran space, and that miscalculation had brought them to the brink of disaster. But within this chaos, the Terrans themselves remained largely unseen. Their strategy relied not on immediate annihilation, but on the calculated dismantling of the Empire's fleet, exploiting arrogance, inexperience, and overconfidence at every turn. The Terrans understood that overwhelming force without control was futile. Precision, patience, and intelligence were far more effective. The first step in the resolution of the conflict began with the Empire's recognition of their dire situation. Commanders convened in their remaining operational ships, attempting to assess the scale of losses and understand what had gone wrong. Hundreds of vessels had been lost or disabled. Communication networks were fragmented, leaving isolated pockets of the fleet completely on their own. Officers debated whether to continue the mission or attempt to retreat. In private, some admitted the terrifying truth: they were outmatched. But publicly, the Council refused to acknowledge defeat. The pride and reputation of the Empire demanded that they maintain the illusion of control, even as reality screamed otherwise. Orders were issued to regroup, to fortify remaining ships, and to attempt to push through the system despite the overwhelming challenges. The stage was set for the Empire's final confrontation with Terran defenses, an encounter that would reveal the full power of a civilization they had underestimated as the fleet maneuvered through the system. Terran defenses became increasingly visible not through conventional means, but through the consequences of their presence. Ships would suddenly find themselves trapped in gravitational distortions, surrounded by invisible energy fields that disrupted engines and navigation. Others were met with pulses of energy that rendered shields useless or caused weapon systems to misfire. Even the largest cruisers, which had once dominated smaller fleets, were vulnerable to these forces. The Terrans had transformed the environment itself into a weapon, turning space into a battlefield in which the Empire's numerical advantage was meaningless. Each attempt by the Empire to regain control was countered by subtle, adaptive responses. The Terrans did not simply attack, they manipulated, neutralized, and outsmarted their opponents, ensuring that any aggressive move by the Empire only made their situation worse. The psychological impact of these strategies on the Empire's crews was profound. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as chaos spread through the Armada. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair systems that were constantly failing, often to no avail. Pilots and navigators became disoriented, unsure of which routes were safe or which anomalies were real. Fear, frustration, and confusion began to dominate every level of command. The Empire's confidence, once absolute, had been shattered. For the first time in living memory, they faced a force they could not control, a system they could not dominate, and a civilization that was far beyond their ability to understand. The Terrans, by remaining largely unseen and allowing their defenses to operate invisibly, ensured that the Empire's sense of inevitability continued to crumble. It was during this stage that the Empire attempted its most aggressive strategies, desperate to assert dominance and salvage some measure of pride. Fleet commanders ordered concentrated attacks, attempting to overwhelm perceived threats with sheer firepower. Battles were fought not against visible enemies, but against the environment itself. Ships were caught in energy traps, thrown into hazardous trajectories and forced into collisions. Weapons misfired or were redirected by unseen forces, causing chaos and friendly fire incidents. Each attack, meant to demonstrate control, only reinforced the Empire's helplessness. The Terrans had turned the very fabric of space into a weapon, exploiting every assumption the Empire had about warfare, strategy, and physics. By now it was clear that conventional tactics would achieve nothing. Victory could not be won through brute force or technological superiority. It required humility, understanding, and adaptation, qualities the Empire had long ignored. The turning point in the resolution came with the destruction of key vessels, including the flagship that had carried the highest-ranking officers. Its loss had been catastrophic in Part 3, leaving the remaining fleet disorganized and vulnerable. Yet in the midst of despair, some of the Empire's commanders began to realize the full nature of the Terran defenses. Unlike any enemy they had encountered, the Terrans did not rely on sheer firepower. Their weapons were integrated into the environment, adaptive, intelligent, and capable of targeting weaknesses the Empire had not even considered. They had studied the Empire's tactics for centuries, predicted its responses, and prepared contingencies for every conceivable maneuver. To fight Terran space was not merely to fight ships, it was to fight a civilization's knowledge and mastery of forces beyond conventional understanding. Realizing that further offensive action was futile, the Empire began to consider retreat. This decision was fraught with tension. Retreat in enemy space was dangerous, and the Terrans had already demonstrated the ability to manipulate the environment to their advantage. Ships attempting to pull back found themselves subjected to precisely calibrated gravitational forces, energy disruptions, and navigational anomalies designed to slow their escape. Even as they retreated, the fleet was under constant pressure, forced to adapt to dangers that could not be seen or predicted. Each step backward required ingenuity, coordination, and courage. The Terrans, though invisible, ensured that the Empire's retreat would be costly, teaching a lesson in humility, respect, and caution. The process of retreat also revealed the resilience of Terran strategy. Unlike conventional battles where one side might win through sheer firepower, Terran tactics focused on preservation of the system itself. Minimal direct engagement, combined with maximal environmental manipulation, allowed the Terrans to defend their territory without exposing themselves unnecessarily. The Empire, in contrast, suffered losses that were disproportionate to the scale of combat. Entire squadrons were lost, and ships that survived were damaged, demoralized, and depleted of resources. The Terrans' patience and intelligence had transformed what could have been a simple defeat into a thorough, humiliating lesson in strategy and foresight. By controlling the pace, the battlefield, and the perception of the Empire's forces, the Terrans maintained complete dominance without conventional confrontation. Throughout this phase, the Empire's crews gained an understanding of their own limitations. Engineers who had once believed they could fix anything learned that some systems were beyond repair when interfered with by advanced Terran technology. Pilots discovered that no amount of skill could overcome environmental manipulations designed to exploit human error and overconfidence. Commanders realized that their experience, training, and historical victories meant nothing against a force that anticipated, adapted, and outmaneuvered them at every turn. This hard-learned lesson in humility became the defining feature of the resolution phase. Victory was no longer possible. Survival became the goal. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the Empire's retreat was not entirely catastrophic. Some ships managed to escape, carrying reports, damaged but intact, back to friendly space. These survivors provided detailed accounts of what they had witnessed: the adaptive energy fields, the environmental the sudden disappearances, and the invisible, intelligent systems that had dominated the engagement. Their testimonies shocked the Empire's leadership. forcing them to confront the reality that Terran space was not only forbidden but lethal to those who entered unprepared. These reports became the foundation for a new understanding of the limits of Empire power and the dangers of arrogance. The resolution phase also highlighted the contrast between Terran strategy and Empire ambition. The Empire had relied on speed, numbers, and technological superiority, believing these alone would ensure success. The Terrans, in contrast, relied on intelligence, observation, and adaptability. They did not fight for glory. They fought to protect their space and to teach a lesson in respect and caution. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the Empire had been comprehensively outmatched, not through direct confrontation alone, but through a combination of strategy, foresight, and mastery of forces that the Empire could not control. The resolution was not a simple battle or a singular moment of victory, but a process in which the Empire's arrogance was methodically dismantled, and their fleet forced into retreat. As the surviving ships left Terran space, the Empire's leaders were left to reflect on the true cost of their ambition. Hundreds of ships had been lost, thousands of crew members killed, and the fleet's reputation had been irreparably damaged. The council and generals faced the uncomfortable truth that their pride and overconfidence had blinded them to centuries of warnings. They had believed that strength and technology were sufficient to guarantee success, but they had been confronted by a civilization whose power was not measured in ships or weapons, but in knowledge, preparation, and strategic mastery. The resolution of this conflict was, therefore, not only a military retreat but a profound lesson in humility, respect, and the limits of empire. Their forces were diminished, their morale shaken, and their assumptions about dominance shattered. The Terrans had defended their space without exposing themselves directly, demonstrating the power of strategy, patience, and intelligence. The Empire had learned a costly lesson: ignoring warnings. Underestimating the unknown and relying solely on force could lead to near annihilation. The resolution was complete, not in the sense of victory or defeat, but in the clear establishment of consequences. Terran space remained forbidden, and the Empire had paid the price for failing to respect it. The Empire returned from Terran space in a state that few in its history had ever seen. The once proud fleets, which had departed with confidence and arrogance, had been reduced in number, damaged beyond repair, and mentally shaken. Ships limped back toward friendly systems, many carrying not just physical damage but crews haunted by the things they had witnessed. The veterans who survived spoke in hushed tones of the phenomena they could not explain, of entire ships disappearing in the blink of an eye, of invisible forces manipulating the environment, and of energy fields that seemed almost sentient. Even the bravest officers admitted privately that they had never faced an opponent like this, an enemy that was not merely a fleet, but an intelligence, a strategy, a civilization that had mastered forces beyond comprehension. The Empire had entered Terran space, expecting conquest, glory, and resources, but instead had found fear, uncertainty, and a profound lesson in humility. Back on the core worlds of the Empire, the return of the fleet caused shockwaves of disbelief and concern. The stories brought back by survivors painted a picture of a civilization that was entirely unlike anything the Empire had previously encountered. For decades, the Empire had expanded through superior technology, overwhelming numbers, and carefully honed tactics. They had believed that no force could resist them, that no system could withstand their power. Terran space shattered those assumptions completely. Historians, strategists, and even politicians pored over reports and testimonies, trying to make sense of the events. They were faced with a reality they had never expected. The galaxy was far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more intelligent than they had allowed themselves to believe. The aftermath of the campaign revealed both immediate and long-term consequences. In the short term, the Empire faced logistical challenges in repairing the damaged ships and tending to the survivors. Entire fleets were rebuilt from scratch. Supplies had to be reallocated, and the loss of experienced officers and crew members created a vacuum in leadership. Pilots who had survived were haunted by memories of sudden disappearances and the strange, intelligent manipulations of Terran defenses. Some fell ill with stress-induced conditions. Others were reluctant to return to active duty, fearing that they might be sent again into unknown and deadly environments. The Empire had suffered losses not just in hardware, but in human capital, and the psychological toll would influence military planning for decades to come. Yet even as the immediate challenges were addressed, the broader lessons of Terran space began to emerge. Scholars, engineers, and military strategists devoted themselves to studying the survivors' reports, trying to understand the mechanisms behind the Terrans' defenses. These studies revealed that the Empire had not been defeated by conventional weapons or brute force. They had been outmatched by intelligence, adaptability, and foresight. Terran space was defended not by overwhelming numbers or destructive firepower, but through a mastery of the environment, precise control over energy systems, and an ability to manipulate perception. The lessons were clear. Raw strength was insufficient. Understanding, respect, and humility were necessary components of survival in the galaxy. Among the surviving officers, Reflections on the events led to a dramatic shift in attitude. Those who had once believed that the Empire's power was absolute now recognized the limits of their technology and strategy. The stories of vanished ships, environmental manipulation, and intelligent defenses served as constant reminders that hubris could be deadly. Young officers, once eager to claim fame through conquest, now studied the campaigns in Terran space with a mixture of awe and fear. Experienced commanders revised their strategies, recognizing that victories in familiar regions did not guarantee success in unknown or forbidden territories. The Terran system had become a benchmark, a symbol of the unpredictable and unknowable dangers that lurked beyond the edges of the known galaxy. Culturally, the Empire underwent a transformation as well. Propaganda and history, which had long glorified expansion and the inevitability of Empire dominance, now had to be reconsidered. Stories of Terran space were no longer dismissed as myth or superstition. They were incorporated into training manuals, strategic simulations, and educational programs for young officers. The narrative shifted from one of absolute superiority to one of caution, respect, and preparation. Terran space became a legend not for the glory of conquest, but for the lessons it imparted about humility, intelligence, and the consequences of arrogance. Those who had returned from the system carried with them not just scars and stories, but a new awareness of the galaxy's complexity and danger. The political impact of the failed campaign was significant. Councils and rulers were forced to confront their own decisions, questioning whether ambition and pride had clouded their judgment. Debates erupted over the wisdom of ignoring centuries of warnings, the ethics of sending unprepared fleets into unknown systems, and the responsibility of leadership when faced with the unknown. Some leaders argued for more cautious expansion policies, advocating reconnaissance, diplomacy, and respect for unknown civilizations. Others resisted, unwilling to admit that the Empire's pride had been humbled. Yet even the most stubborn factions could not ignore the evidence. Terran space had proven the limits of their authority and the dangers of overconfidence. Meanwhile, the survivors' accounts inspired fear, fascination, and a renewed interest in exploration. Scientists and engineers were driven to develop new technologies capable of detecting, understanding, and countering the kinds of defenses employed by the Terrans. Strategists studied environmental manipulation, adaptive systems, and the psychological tactics used against the fleet, hoping to create a knowledge base that could prevent similar disasters in the future. Pilots and crew members shared their experiences and training programs, emphasizing the importance of caution, observation, and respect for the unknown. The campaign in Terran space became a case study, a warning, and a guide for future generations who would navigate the perils of the galaxy psychologically. The experience had a profound effect on the Empire's personnel. Survivors grappled with fear and disbelief, knowing that they had faced forces beyond their comprehension and lived to tell the tale. Some struggled with guilt, believing they could have acted differently to prevent the losses of their comrades. Others experienced a deep sense of awe, recognizing that the universe was far more intelligent and complex than they had ever imagined. Even leaders who had initially dismissed the warnings found themselves haunted by the consequences of their decisions. The events in Terran space became a shared trauma, shaping the identity and culture of the Empire. For decades to come, the Empire also began to reconsider its approach to diplomacy and exploration. The lesson of Terran space was clear. Not every system could be conquered, and not every civilization could be measured by conventional metrics of power. Where once they had relied solely on intimidation and force, they now recognized the need for intelligence, observation, and negotiation. Scholars and diplomats studied Terran society from a distance, trying to understand what had allowed such a small civilization to defend itself so effectively against one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy. The idea of forbidden space, once dismissed as superstition, now became a cornerstone of interstellar policy. There were regions to avoid, boundaries to respect, and civilizations whose capabilities should not be underestimated. Over time, the story of the Empire's campaign in Terran space became legendary. It was retold in military academies, recorded in historical chronicles, and studied by scholars across multiple systems. The narrative focused less on the Empire's initial arrogance, and more on the lessons learned, the importance of preparation, the dangers of hubris, and the recognition that intelligence and adaptability could outweigh raw strength. Survivors were celebrated not just for their courage, but for their ability to survive in circumstances where conventional tactics failed entirely. The campaign became a symbol of the consequences of ignoring warnings, of underestimating the unknown, and of venturing into forbidden territories without humility or respect at the same time. The Empire's relationship with Terran space remained complex. The system itself continued to be regarded as off-limits, a region that had proven its lethality and strategic sophistication. Future fleets were instructed to avoid the area unless fully prepared and authorized, and reconnaissance missions became mandatory before any engagement in previously unexplored systems. Terran space was no longer just a point on a map. It had become a symbol, a lesson, and a warning to all who would attempt to expand beyond the known galaxy. The memory of what had occurred lingered in the minds of all who had participated, shaping the Empire's approach to space exploration and warfare permanently in the long-term aftermath. The campaign prompted the Empire to invest heavily in new technologies and strategies. Engineers and scientists developed advanced sensors, adaptive defense systems, and simulation programs designed to prepare crews for environments similar to Terran space. Military academies revised their curricula to include psychological resilience, risk assessment, and the study of unknown phenomena. Strategic planning emphasized caution, observation, and respect for intelligence over sheer aggression. The lessons learned in Terran space became central to the Empire's evolution, influencing policy, education, and military doctrine for generations. Finally, the personal reflections of the survivors and leaders became a central part of the Empire's cultural memory. Those who had witnessed Terran space firsthand often spoke of a profound sense of humility, awe, and respect. They recounted the invisible forces, the adaptive defenses, and the intelligence that had protected the system, emphasizing that power alone was not sufficient to survive in the galaxy. These stories were passed down through generations, ensuring that no one would forget the consequences of arrogance, the necessity of preparation, and the value of respecting boundaries that were marked not by law, but by the wisdom of civilizations far older and more advanced than the Empire itself. The Empire had survived, but it was forever changed. Terran space remained forbidden, a region whose dangers had been demonstrated in the harshest possible way. The survivors returned not as conquerors, but as witnesses, their experiences shaping the Empire's future, its policies, and its understanding of the galaxy. The lessons of hubris, respect, and caution became central to the Empire's identity. While the campaign had cost them dearly in ships, personnel, and pride, it also provided knowledge, perspective, and a warning that would endure for generations. The Empire had paid the price for ignoring Terran space, and that price would be remembered as a defining moment in its history.